Waking Up is Not Enough. Flourishing in the Human Space, a podcast by Polly Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger. When you peek into the cosmic unity of existence and feel the love and inspiration of awakening, what happens next? Whether it's through meditation, spiritual practice, near-death experience, ingesting a mind-altering substance, or being born again, you don't get a map for improving your messy life. In this podcast, Polly Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger draw on expertise in science, psychology, adult development, psychedelics, NDEs, dreams, and Buddhist practice in conversations about compassion, resilience, responsibility, kindness, and development after awakening. You will learn how to chart a new path for flourishing in the human space, in which waking up is important, but not enough, and growing up is never finished. Co-hosts Polly Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger bring different kinds of expertise. Polly is an author, psychologist, Jungian analyst, longtime Zen practitioner, couple therapist, and founder of Dialogue Therapy and Real Dialogue. Michael Berger is an entrepreneur, an expert in psychedelics, a spiritual practitioner of Jewishness, a skeptic, a Real Dialogue specialist, and a filmmaker who is known for his documentary, Improbable Collapse, The Demolition of Our Republic. Polly and Mike will engage with each other and invite a wide array of guests who are accomplished scientists and seekers whose work lies beyond the hegemony of materialism.
Hi, this is Polly Young-Eisendrath with a brief message about why you should fund our podcast on GoFundMe. We are trying to keep this podcast free and available to lots of different kinds of people all over the world. While we address the issue of awakening and what happens next, on this podcast we are also devoted to understanding the cutting edge of new scientific discoveries and spiritual seeking that show how much we humans, with our self-awareness, participate in creating the world in which we live. Whether it's through our conversations with each other or our individual perceptions that we share through language and witnessing, we participate in creating the lives that we live and experience. So please help us keep this podcast free and keep it on the air by donating any amount you can afford to us at the GoFundMe link to our page, which is available right close to the description of the podcast on whatever channel you're listening to. I thank you so much for listening to the podcast and also for supporting us in any way you can. Thank you again.
Polly and Mike talk with writer and speaker Terry Moore, whose recent book, Here.Now.One, a practical guide to spiritual life, sheds light on ways to make spiritual practice an integrated part of everyday life, and whose recent TED Talk directs our attention to oneness. In this conversation, Terry talks about the nature of awakening and the ways people's spiritual concerns and beliefs can become one-sided and empty of vitality. Terry's created a map or model called the Unified Path that assesses and instructs how individuals can engage body, mind, soul, and heart in whatever practices they are currently doing. In speaking widely and deeply about the meaning of religion, God, and the search for truth, Terry, Mike, and Polly investigate the conundrum of language and how we talk about the ineffable.
So, hi, Terry and Mike. It's great to be here with you, and especially with you, my dear friend, Terry Moore.
who's also now the president of our board at the Center for Real Dialogue. So welcome, Terry Moore.
Polly, it's amazing to be here. We've known each other a very long time. It's been a very interesting journey, which I'm pleased to have shared with you in many occasions and in many ways.
Yes, it's actually a little risky to say how long we've known each other, because then people will begin to estimate our ages as being like 100 or something. So, we're here today to talk about many things, but particularly your sort of newly developed, I would say, spiritual practice, spiritual model called the Unified Path. But I want to start first by asking you what we always ask people on the podcast which is, what do you think awakening is? Like, how do you define it or describe it?
Oh, my. Awakening, enlightenment, moksha are terms that are very difficult to define. Yet everybody really knows what they are intuitively. But practically speaking, let's just say that for at least for all of recorded history, as far as we know, there has been an experience of knowledge which has presented itself as overwhelmingly significant, the knowledge to which no other knowledge is compared, a knowledge that is uncreated and above all other knowledge, and the knowing of which is the final happiness, the greatest happiness in life, and makes all of the suffering of the ages as nothing. And this is an experience of knowing that some have worked diligently for years of struggle and privation to try to achieve. Sometimes it has fallen on people almost as if by accident, because as it says in the Gospels, the truth blows where it will. I mean, we in many ways have an artificial view of what awakening or enlightenment is, because the history of awakening and spirituality tends to be a history that was created by people who are literate or who lived in literate organizations. So when we hear about great saints and sages, they tend to be the saints and sages that we know about from history, who have written about these experiences, or others who have written about them and their experience. And we don't hear about the thousands, the millions of people who have awakened either by their own struggle or on occasion.
Except on this podcast, we hear from them here.
And if, yes, well, there is this podcast, of course,
Right.
that was the logical exception.
Right. So you use this term moksha, which is not a term that most of our highly awakened interlocutors have used. And so I wonder if you could tell us what that is. And also, I found your definition to be interesting, and as you said, sort of literary and sort of biblical. So I would like to start with just asking you about what you just said, and also this term moksha, which I don't believe we've heard here.
I've borrowed a number of terms from various spiritual traditions that I do not participate in because it seemed like the right term at the right time. My sense is there are probably volumes, if not libraries, on the term moksha, which I take as a term for liberation. And I simply meant it in that sense, without any of its historical or technical meaning, simply a liberation from the world of space and time and cause and effect.
Where does it come from, Terry? Moksha?
I believe it's Sanskrit.
I know that you do have a very deep knowledge of Sufism as a part of Islam. And
well, I mean, just sitting here Googling the term, first response is, in Hinduism and Jainism, the term refers to a release from the cycle of rebirth.
So Hinduism and Jainism, that's interesting to me. So that would not, not necessarily bring it into Buddhism. So
it's consistent with what I was saying. With further definition, it is the transcendent state attained as a result of being released from the cycle of birth and death.
So that's what, again, in Buddhism, there are different kinds of liberation. And that would be the kind of liberation in which the individual would get out of space-time or off the wheel of samsara, life and death. And that was a part of the earliest developments of the Buddhist teaching, which in some ways were, sort of a critique of Jainism.
There are all sorts of historical ways to try to describe that which is finally indescribable. And those ways can be helpful and can point the direction and may even be of assistance. But
Right.
finally, they're concepts and their language.
And how about you, your experiences or
About
your
me.
own language, your own language about awakening, your own awakening, or what point to it for you, or what,
Oh, I've had a number of very powerful experiences. And I guess I want to just digress and say, not that this is about having experiences, but there are things that have happened to me. That the fundamental one was in my 11th year of high school during a grammar exercise in which the teacher put on the board a number of words and said to punctuate it in terms of a sentence. And the words were that, is, that, is, not, is, not. And you punctuated it correctly. It read, that is, that is not, is not. And I was just struck dumb by it. I just stared at it and thought, that's the whole thing. That's the whole thing. And I came back after class and looked at the board and looked at those words, because that is, and that is not. And also it would say that is not, isn't.
at that moment you had some awareness of something that you had not previously known at all.
Yes, and that highlighted it. Although I always suppose I grew up with sort of this belief that there's more, um, but non-specific. I was not part of a particularly religious family. This was the suburban Midwest. Church was more about social activities, certainly, than it was about mysticism. So, but this high school event really turned me on to the notion that there's more here. And that really sent me down the path of trying to find out what it was, how to find out about it, what I might learn.
So I'm reminded of the poem, Who Makes the Grass Green? In that you had to put the punctuation, and the punctuation gave it its significance and meaning. And then you had a much deeper experience of meaning in in transcending. It's difficult to use language to speak about the ineffable, right? But it's a way of transcending language in playing with that meaning and that the punctuation, which gives it its potency.
Yes, a good point. And similarly, for all the language in the world, I think if one is going to describe or point to the transcendent, it's probably better done in art than it is in language.
Well, I have to say that all of us are using language here. And for all of the years that I've been a Zen practitioner since 1970, there has been so much language used on how we can't use language to say these things that we're saying and how we can't reach them, et cetera, et cetera. So language does play its part. And just as Mike said this about your sentences, Terry, those are two, I think, I thought about a poem by Howard Nemeroff called The Blue Swallows. And at the end of the poem, the line says, because the mind's eye lit the sun. In other words, the poem is about transcendence, but then it reminds us that it is the mind's eye. It's not the sun. So that the sun without the mind's eye is not light. And that idea, again, of how, let's say, inadequate language is, but on the other hand, without it, well, we wouldn't be lighting the sun.
Well, no, agreed. It's a tool, and it's all we have. I wanted to advocate art as another way of describing this, but yes, it is a tool, and we use it, but we also often tend to absolutize it, and that's
Same with mental image. That's where you can get into the art thing, is that, like, is a mental image or an image somehow better at communicating than a word? But the mental image has to be interpreted in words. And since I did take studio art for a while, I can tell you that there's a lot of critique. There is no just image. You've got people commenting on the image, telling you whether it's really getting there or not. So somehow people have this idea that there is
Yeah,
something that we can get.
yeah, right. But those are all words and that's all discussion. But in fact, we can take an incident like Mike is describing about the sentence about the green, the grass. And
But
that's
I saw,
successful.
no, well, look, he said it, say it again, Mike, it's a koan.
Well, who's the one who makes the grass green? I think to me it relates to what Paula you were speaking about the mind's eye and the sun. I can't say anything about the sun. I can only speak about my first person subjective experience. I can only or mainly language it, but that meaning is so subjective. And I experience myself in a world where too frequently I catch myself speaking as if I'm making some statement about objective reality and fact, which is no matter what, still a first person opinion. But we live in this kind of cage of words, and the words become things in themselves, but they're not. They're just words. And we attribute to each other as if we each have a shared dictionary and lexicon that we all know what we mean. Often when we slow down and take the time to talk to each other, we may find that what sounds like the same words in the same context have an entirely different meaning once
Right.
we sit down and slow down.
Or individuals have their own interpretations based on their own experience, history, and baggage.
And that's, I think, continuous. The individuals have their own interpretations based on their history, experience, and baggage, so that's an inescapable constraint. I think the awakening, the properties of awakening, descriptions of awakening have been, I think, as you indicated, Terry, largely left by people who practiced religions or spiritual practices. However, in this period of time, we have scientists recording what's happening under influences of psychedelics, under influences of deep meditative states, and then also near-death experiences. All of these have some things in common. These experiences as humans describe them. And of course, all we do have is our human description, whether it's a description of what goes on in the Hadron Collider, or it's a description of how you see things through a telescope, or it's a description of your own awakening. So, I liked your particular description, Terry, of your original, like noticing that, that something is and something is not, or that is, and that is not, because in a sense, I believe, did rely on words, that caught you. I will, yeah, I think that's great that caught you, that moment caught you, because it was something about a Terry Moore moment, and it was around 11th grade.
It was the right concept at the right time that had a particular effect on me. And yes, it involved words. It worked that time.
So I wonder if that has anything to do with the title of your book, Here, period, Now, period, One. And so the subtitle is A Practical Guide to Spiritual Life, but Here, Now, One has lots of periods. And so did your original, construction of this moment. You had to put the periods in, right?
Right. Well, I think a comma and a semicolon, but that's okay. That's okay.
So tell us about really the title of the book first. I'm interested especially in what you mean by one and what you might mean by oneness, if you go that far with it.
By one, I mean the one, the great one, the basis of all reality, the ground of all being, the one, the perfect Brahman, God, that one, the one referred to in most religions. In Judaism, our God is one. In Islam, there is but one God, and so forth and so on. We hear this all the time. That's the one. And the experience of the one involves being here and now. So the one which is only here and now, because it couldn't be anything else other than here and now. And knowing it requires that we do what we can to bring ourselves into the present, here and now, so that we can open ourselves to this knowledge, appreciation, understanding, connection to the transcendent one.
And I was thinking of the Vedanta saying, which I'm sure you know, that the truth is one and men call it variously. Of course, back then they were
Yes.
saying that men, back when I first learned that. Now I
Well,
guess,
yes, the language has been improved since then. But I've also heard there's one God, but there are many gods.
yeah, in Buddhism, there is not really one God. So there's no superintendent God for sure, but there are many gods. But there is oneness, but the oneness is formless without any word, and so
Well,
cannot be, you know.
yes, and now we get to the fact that you can't say anything about oneness because there isn't any about if
Yes,
it's one
that's
if it's
right, right,
oneness.
right. So anyway, your spiritual path that's outlined in the book is both pragmatic and transcendent, correct?
My objective was to be practical.
Practical. You don't like the word pragmatic?
No, I like the word pragmatic.
Okay.
I think that's a good description. I say that because most of my life I've been reading spiritual literature that is philosophical and metaphysical, and I've had enough of that.
Can
It's
you
time.
tell them?
It's time to do something that's practical and helpful immediately, here and now, and one.
So yes, and so I would like you to tell Mike, and I know a little more about this about you, but your metaphysical and theoretical studies are pretty deep and unusual. Could you share some of that with us?
Yes, well, I mean, this all started long time ago when a number of friends and I decided we would set out to try to find a path. We would try to find a spiritual methodology. We would find a teacher, and we looked at this. We met every week, and we all worked pretty hard at this. Um, we found a lot of religion, but we didn't find much mysticism.
What year was that roughly?
This was early 90s. We'd go to places that we thought we could find that kind of guidance, monasteries and so forth, and found that there really wasn't much actual practice other than formulaic practice. There wasn't much individual focus and growth. But we looked at a lot of things, and we became, very, very knowledgeable about comparative religion and comparative mysticism. And finally, we found a philosophy or a group of authors known as perennialists. And perennialism is the philosophy of the Sophia Perennis, which is to say that there is one perennial truth that is refracted into many traditions as white light is refracted into colors, and that all of these great traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, and so forth, all lead back to the same source. Their language is different. Sometimes their methodology is a little bit different, but it's remarkably similar. So we found this teaching called perennialism, and one of the wonderful things about perennialism is it accepted everything. It did not tout one particular form as being better or more efficient or more honorable than another. It looked at them all with the same lens. So in contacting those authors, it turns out that they, in fact, were part of a Sufi order, was at that point headed by one of the great philosophers who had written many of these books, Frithjof Schuon, whose perhaps most notable book is titled The Transcendent Unity of Religion, which says it all in many ways. And he elaborates on that in many articles and many books. He's a wonderful, a brilliant, poetic, metaphysical genius. And I'd recommend his books to anyone who is seriously interested in learning about these things. Became part of that Sufi order for many years and became a senior functionary in the order. And then, about 10 years ago, some of my colleagues and I decided that there was something missing, and that it was, in fact, that element of individual attention and growth and work that was not available. So we added to that a number of practices and workshops in our expression, our practice of that which was traditional, in an attempt to modify or amplify that. And that goes on to this day.
I just want to jump in. I have a question about that search. In various traditions, there appears to be kind of an exoteric or the doctrine that's taught to the masses, and then there's always a hidden kernel, this esoteric truth, which
Indeed.
seems to be protected or maintained by, for lack of a better term, either some would call it gatekeepers, but they're protecting this,
Yes, that's right.
this hidden tradition, so that it maintains, I guess, so that there's a lineage or a line of continuity that's passed down.
Well, first, one of the reasons they're protecting their esoteric practice is that it would have been seen as heretical within the context of their own tradition, and they would have been lynched or burned, or history is full of those examples. Now, your other point, which is worth considering and I think reconsidering, is if you have a teaching and it is a valid doctrine and process and has been shown over time, maybe short time, to be effective, what you want to do is to preserve that, and consequently you create some sort of organization or hierarchy that has gatekeepers that can preserve it. But at the same time, you introduce a human element of hierarchy and politics and interpersonal play that is poisonous. And you really have your choice of either not doing it or doing it with the notion of it eventually becoming corrupt, because people are people. And that's probably the best choice. But times have changed now, and we're not really burning witches anymore, except maybe the academy. But there's general widespread, I guess, indifference to spiritual practice widely, and it's being part of or partaking in a particular tradition or practice is no longer a threat to one's existence. And most people wouldn't understand it, so it doesn't matter.
So those are, I mean, those words of, it was as though you assumed that there's a spiritual practice without people doing it. I mean, there could be, but I haven't been familiar with it. I mean, we have to introduce people to any spiritual practice, or you ain't got anything.
No, I meant in the sense of creating a hierarchy,
Yeah.
And authorization and gatekeepers.
Okay, so you could be a Krishnamurti, for example, who didn't want hierarchy, but then he has very few people that really understand what he's talking about. Well, people grasp that at some level, but there's
this is inevitable. But this is inevitable, Polly, because nothing is for everyone.
No, of course not.
And that's part of the issue here, that if one wants to grow and open oneself to these things, one needs to find that which works or that which is available.
So, I mean, originally when Shakyamuni Buddha taught about 2,600 years ago, he did have this one teaching that really is about the esotericism versus the exotericism, which he said, if I hold up my hand and I say I have a jewel in my hand, you have to believe me. But if I open my hand and show it to you, that's different. And so he wanted to open his hand and show it. So you would have to find it. He couldn't give it to you, but he could show it to you. And I do think that the Buddhist path has, let's say, among world religions, at least attempted to have lots of practical methods. Now, it's always questionable whether people, as you mentioned, at various levels of development, can embrace methods, no matter how simple those methods might be, for example, to follow your breath. But, I think that the Buddhist path was trying to, from the beginning, give some practical ways of getting to awakening, possibly even then getting outside of space-time. At least that was the idea. But as you mentioned, Terry, once things get systematized and there is a hierarchy, then there's a whole different ballpark.
Yes, that's right. And going back to Mike's point again about esotericism, in the Great Search, one of the landmarks for me was finding Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous.
Yeah,
because it was that book that opened up the notion of esotericism, and the fact that in all of these hard practices that have been done so long, there was an element of magic that if one could find it.
That book was the opening. That was absolutely it.
Is that right?
The year was 1970. And I read it and I took to the bed. I stopped speaking. I was overwhelmed because I figured all the people that I grew up with were going to be sucked back into being rocks and minerals because they had no self-awareness. It's
Well, I didn't know this part of your story, and I've known you for a long time.
it's
It's
really,
interesting. It's the same book that had that effect on you.
yeah, and I imagine it had on Mike too. I mean, there was a time, and honestly, at that particular moment, I also met Phil Lesh from the Grateful Dead, who was reading In Search of the Miraculous. So I had a long conversation with him about it. But really, when I first started, what I really captured in my mind what Uspensky was talking about, I had not any knowledge of Gurdjieff at all. I happened on
Right.
to In Search of the Miraculous. But it really depressed me because I thought about the people that I grew up with and how they had no self-awareness. And I was absolutely certain, even then, back then when I was, I don't know, 20 or whatever I was, I was certain they had no capacity for developing self-awareness, and they were going to be sucked down into, the sort of bottom of the cosmos as a result when they died. So that was sort of where I went with that. But it did get me looking.
Well, I didn't have the same reaction. I thought that it was a wonderful new perspective that I was eager to share, and you could find everywhere once you knew it existed. So that's what got my group interested in looking at religions, for example, trying to find their spiritual heart. The statement's been made. I can't quote the person, but the statement is obviously true. Religions begin as mysticism and end as politics.
I think it was Ouspensky who was quoting Gurdjieff as saying, decency, how can you have decency on a planet of sleeping beings? And I believe Ouspensky said he really didn't understand the impact of, or the import of what Gurdjieff had said until he was in a French cafe. I think this was World War I, until he saw a truck with artificial limbs going to the front before they had been blown off. And that's how he understood the significance. And then about who's the one who makes the grass green, there was an article I read this week, and I'm not sure it was, I believe it was an Eastern European country that has a lot of amber, and burglars broke into an older woman's home and they stole her gold jewelry. And what they didn't see was she had a tremendously large piece of red amber that she used as a doorstop. And they found out that I think it may have been either Albania or Romania, but the government purchased it from her for $1 million to put it in a museum. So again, it was just a doorstop or a rock to them and to her until somebody pointed out what it was.
That's a great story.
It is indeed.
Yeah, that really is. I want to get around to the unified path from the path that we're following, which is may not seem very unified to listeners, but it seems to me right now there is a way that we're understanding something together. Because for one thing, perhaps In Search of the Miraculous was a big turning point for all of us, and I think perhaps has been for many others in terms of trying to understand, was there something, I mean, I would say from my own experience, I had really quite a few mystical experiences as a child. You could say that, or you could say I was slightly psychotic all along there, but I did put these things
Words
into,
again.
well, no, I mean, and they refer to different kinds of things, all of which are valid. I put this into a context of that the visible world is not the world. I knew that there was more world beyond the visible world. I absolutely knew it. There was no question. Started young. And then I was trying to find essentially a grown-up who would say that, and nobody would, even in the Catholic Church. I mean, the idea there was you have to be very, very careful because you could get possessed by the devil if you go looking for experiences. Like experiences, no. Prayer, yes. Dogma, yes. But actual experiences, no. In Search of the Miraculous was a turning point in that regard. But,
And let's refer back to Mike's comment. And this is what happens when you decide that the truth has to have a structure and an organization and a hierarchy and gatekeepers.
yeah, though I would say the Catholic Church got there over a long period of time. The Buddhists had a longer time, and they really didn't do the same thing, frankly. So I just want to point that out. They've never created Rome or Mecca or Athens or anything. They've just they've muddled along, and in muddling along, well, there have been pluses and minuses. So, there is the Catholic Church way, there's the way of Rome, there's the way of Mecca,
There
but
are
there are other ways.
all of these ways.
There are
There
all
are
these
all of
ways.
these ways.
So what is your way, Terry? Why did you do the unified path at this particular moment in Terry Moore's life? Why now?
Uh, Mostly because what I saw was true for me. I wanted to offer to others who could use that perspective. More often than not, that's not a fair statement. Very often, I would find myself in circles of spiritual friends and associates, many of whom had been in that circle for years, if not decades, and were feeling stuck or lost, or their practice had become rote or empty, or they would ask questions like, when am I going to get it? When will the penny drop? When will I be awakened? And generally, the teachers of those groups generally would say practice more of what we're doing, or increase your practice. Well, that may not be the best thing. That is to increase maybe one element of a whole, which needs to be looked at in its whole rather than from one point of view. Now, if we look at what we know about the great saints and sages of history, and I think if you're talking about Saint Teresa or Ibn Arabi or Shankara, you're looking back at somebody who is the product of an institutionalized process, of an organized teaching that had components and stages to it. And those components and stages directed the individual to use all of their being to open themselves to knowledge, to the one, to the truth, to God. And in order to do that, one has to look at oneself as a whole and see what elements there are. In this system, the unified path, it takes very simple vocabulary, which could even be simplified, I suppose, but we call it body, mind, heart, and soul. And that in one's practice, one has to address or deal with or be involved with, participate in all of these elements of one's self, because one needs to look at oneself as a whole. One will have different emphases at different parts of one's spiritual journey. And there are differences, of course, between individuals, but to the degree that we are practicing or we are doing something that we think is going to lead us to an understanding or an awareness or an opening, we need to use our body, our minds, our hearts, and our souls. And that is to say, rituals for the body, doctrines for the mind, objects of devotion or worship for the heart, and interior process for the soul, whether that's meditation or introspection. And all of these elements need to be in play. And as I looked at the people I know who were having various difficulties in their practice, some of these elements weren't there at all. And in many ways, this is true of the Sufi group that I'm part of, in that it was a very intellectual group, very much full of scholars, very much about doctrine. And it tended to look down on what would be known as Bhaktic acts in Hinduism. Yet that plays an important part. Similarly, the people I know who would have looked down on these things had a very worshipful attitude toward the teacher, which I think often serves that purpose. But that, again, is only one element. There's still the mind and the heart and the soul that need their own tools at their own level, in their own strength, in order that one be as open as possible.
So in your founding this unified path, let me just ask you, I mean, I'm tempted to ask you the difference between the soul and the heart, but I'll let that behind for a moment. But these different modalities, let's just call them that, or registers, the heart, the mind, the soul, and the body, those, you're not, I mean, I've heard you say in an interview, you're not defining a new religion or a new practice. You're trying to, I don't know, give something like pointers or a map for people to
Yes.
use in their own practice or in their own
Yes.
religions.
Yes, that's right. And whether your practice is a full traditional institutionalized practice from Islam or Judaism or Christianity, or whether you are part of a new age practice of some kind, all of these elements need to be part of your practice in one way or another, form or another.
Do you have like my first question about it was like, who's checking you. Like, in all of my practices where I was really working with teachers, I was checked by the teacher. They had questions or they had, assessments essentially, like, tell me what happened. And then I would say it, and then they'd say, well, it's a this or a that, or go look for a this or a that or whatever. Are there
Yeah.
boxes to check,
No,
or how does it
Polly,
work?
I think that's great if you can get it, and if those checkers really are of the right quality and do understand you and have enough interaction with you that they can be helpful to you personally as an individual. In the unified path, it is entirely a self-assessment.
Okay, it's entirely self-assessment, and
Entirely a self-assessment.
and you have questions to the self then?
Questions to yourself about how much of your activity or your energy is involved in something worshipful, because that's an important part. That needs to be there to some degree. It may be worship of God. It may be a divinity or divinities. It may be an idea. It may be art. It may be goodness, but there has to be some active participation that frees this element of the individual.
So Mike was going to ask something there, so Mike, go ahead.
I was going to just comment that there's this hierarchy and structure within what I hear you describing within ourselves. And again, we apply it and project it out into the world. This becomes this
Yeah.
reified structure in the world, which in the same way within ourselves, if I cling too tightly to my beliefs or this structure, I may get lost and miss the whole point, which is what the structure helps me to see that's beyond it.
Very, very good. Exactly. The only thing I disagree with is the term hierarchy, because they are all required components. There is not necessarily a hierarchy, and that will vary from person to person. Whether your own individual awakening or needs a more worshipful activity or a more intellectual activity or a more physical activity. Let's not leave the body behind. We have bodies. Will vary from individual to individual, but you got it exactly right.
So in my mind, the hierarchy regards, to me, the most basic level is what some religions would refer to as the base level, physicality. Without that grounding, to me, that's the grounding, the connection between earth and being here now in this body. So that was what I was referring to in a sense, hierarchical.
I agree. We're here, we have bodies. How can we leave them out of this process of awakening?
It's a bit challenging to be a disembodied spirit, and there are certain teachings, especially that I've come across in the New Age, that in essence are facilitating you becoming this disembodied spiritual entity, as if your physical being is irrelevant.
Well, maybe that works for some, and those who would strongly advocate that, I think my question would be, how's that working for you?
So I have to bring up the other side, that here in Vermont, I find there are many, and I'll just say New Agey, but I don't even know what the word is for it anymore. People who believe in things like more kale, less gluten. Like, most of their faith is in diet. And so most of their preoccupation is their body. Like, how do I feel right now? Did that meal did that end up being what I was looking for? So I've noticed this weird kind of religion of diet, body, exercise can be in there too. And yoga is not then a spiritual discipline. Yoga is to actually work with the myofascia. So, there's the overemphasized body in some practices around me, where people endlessly talk about diet.
And it is often connected with this notion that I want to be in this body forever, and I'm trying to extend it because it's the only reality there is.
Well, some time ago, you observed, and I think it was most accurate, that the way people express or feel or behave about their bodies, maybe particularly in Vermont, but I certainly see it elsewhere, is really a translation of the way people used to feel about their church and their God and their spiritual activities.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. So now I'm happy to say to those people, your body is an important component. Stay with that. Now there are these other three things
right.
that make you whole that you need to pay attention to.
So what would you say to somebody here in Vermont who is absolutely captured by and actually carries out rituals of, drinking and food. I don't mean alcoholic drinking at all. No, indeed. I mean making exactly the right tea, exactly the right mushroom, the reishi and this and that mushroom in the tea, and then the exact, right vegetable, et cetera, et cetera. And this goes on in a ritualistic way, more than kosher cooking. So how would you suggest that person worship anything other than a mushroom?
Well, the first thing I would ask that person is, what is it you want? What are you after?
I think that probably the answer would be, again, I'm guessing on this because I haven't asked that, but something like serenity and calm and openness to experience.
Well, are you finding that? And if in fact you feel like that practice could be improved, maybe there's some other dimensions of your being that you could address in addition to this practice. But it's not my job to persuade you that this is wrong, only to say that looking at yourself holistically in terms of not only the body, but these other elements will serve you better.
So I hear you, Terry, talking about the magical word integration, right?
Yes.
Bringing all of this into life.
Yes, integration, bringing it all into life. And in that process, finding the forms of these activities that help you. Maybe it's, and we're talking about the body, maybe it's a short form of yoga. Maybe it's some sort of martial art practice. Maybe it's simply walking, but it needs to be addressed consciously, and although I hate to use the word mindfully, as part of your process of living your life so that you can get what you want, which you're telling me is opening and awakening.
So, and the magic, again, of playing with that word again, but of language, right? In form, embodied, informed. So we're connecting to the form being an embodiment of this practice. That's the integration, that it's bringing it permeates all of my being on all of these different dimensions. And without being embodied, I'm disconnected from kind of the foundation that brings everything to life.
Yes, it's not embodied. What is it? It's a concept. It's in the
So
mind. It's just in the mind. Just one of those things.
what about entheos, though, rather than embodied? Because what I find missing often for people these days is any notion of, I'm just going to use the word God here. In Buddhism, in Zen particularly, we certainly use the word God. God meaning that formless unity. Now, my grandson, when he was 4 years old, I think this is when he was 4, I went to a Christmas Eve service with him. He had never been to church or anything like a church, and we were rushing to get dressed, etc. And he said to me, so his father really wanted him to go to church. And he said to me, Grandma, what's church? And I said, well, have you never heard of it? No, he hadn't. I said, well, it's a place where people go to worship God. And he said, what's God? Just like that. And I said, well, let's go and see if we can find out. And so when we got there was a video of children, it was made in New Zealand, playing basically the nativity scene. And there was a kid playing God on the video. And of course, here's my grandson, has never heard about any of this. And so the kid who's playing God says, human beings are having a lot of problems on Earth. There's climate problems, there's money problems, people are sick, and so on. What can we do? And then the various people in the video say, we'll send Superman, we'll send somebody to rescue. And then I believe somebody in the video, I can't remember whether it's Mary or something, says, let's send a baby. And my grandson burst out into this laughter, and he was just laughing like crazy. And of course, his father and I were going, shh, shh. And he said, did you hear that? They said, send a baby. They're going to send a baby to rescue people. And I said, well, you just need to listen a little further. But as the story went on, he was listening, and he got the gist of it. And after the service, and we were eating dinner, and I said, well, what'd you think? He said, nothing there for me. And actually, he couldn't make sense of it. And because he'd never heard of God, never heard of church. Now he does go to church, and now he's very interested at 9. And he does have lots of questions about God, but that's because his father kept taking him to church. So, I think the important thing about God is that maybe, we're in a period of time where the ego counts more, where, hey, I want to feel calm. I want to feel serene. I want to be at ease. But there's nothing like a fear of God, like there used to be. And so I wonder how God comes into that conversation on the unified
Well,
path. People
I,
aren't.
I think generally God does not come into that conversation. And in my years of experience as a spiritual teacher, unless someone has some notion of the transcendent, they're not going to go anywhere, and they might as well play pinball.
You don't think they can happen onto it?
Yes, they can happen onto it, but I'm saying there's nothing I can do if they don't have the question or the sense.
You can't really, you don't feel that you can make the accident happen. You're waiting for them to happen onto it or ask the
Well,
question.
I'm always happy to, to try to ask questions people can't answer or that point them in another direction. But and it's nice, it's rewarding to get good answers to those things sometimes. But generally, in my experience, if people don't have this notion that there is a transcendent or there is something that I'm moving toward or wanting to learn more about or open myself up to, then I can't do much with them. Now, there are a lot of people in the world who don't have that, and it would be nice if they did. Maybe you could help them.
But my grandson, it was really when he said, "What's God?" And I said, "Well, let's go to church where they worship God to find out if we can find out." And at least he was going somewhere where people were talking
Yes.
about God. But I think God
That's good, and I'm in favor of God. I really
in
am.
favor of God.
Yeah.
Yeah, it used to be when I grew up, of course, there was a lot of God talk. And I did go to a place where people talked about God a lot. And of course, I had definitions, et cetera, et cetera. We're coming back to language here. But if the word has never been introduced,
Yeah.
and you're 4 or 5 years old, there's nothing that would necessarily provoke you to that issue, unless you almost died, or something, sometimes accidents, crises, occasionally, a grandparent or something.
Sure, near-death experiences,
Yeah,
some of life's more profound mysteries, like you were just saying, the death of one's relative.
somebody, yes, a
Yes,
death of a relative, yeah.
yes, all these things are opportunities to ask the questions. What is
But if,
this? What is
but if,
this?
but of course, there aren't for many people the traditions where God gets mentioned, or something that transcends this experience that we have, that somehow, I am important here, and I need to feel a certain way, and I need to think a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder, on the worship side of things, I guess that's the soul side of the unified path.
Uh,
Eh,
that's the heart side.
that's the heart side. Okay, so then well, then tell me the difference between the soul and the heart.
The heart is, in fact, those worshipful devotional components. The soul is the immediate operation of the internal, which is to say meditation in any of its form, or a practice that takes one inside to ask questions, to experiment with one's perceptions of oneself and the world in a formal practice of some kind. Maybe it's the direct path, or maybe it's headlessness or the Sedona method. These are all new age things. Something that allows us to work out things, see the things, manage the things inside ourselves. And
So where do psychedelics fit into the unified path? I think
what an interesting question. There are a number of things that blur the lines between these parts of the soul. Art would be one. Service is another. Service fills the bill for it could be physical, it could be devotional. Psychedelics cross some of these lines too. And I don't know exactly where I would put psychedelics at the moment, but I'm very pleased that the study of psychedelics has now become much more organized and legitimate than it was back when I was taking psychedelics. I don't know. I think there clearly needs to be more research on that topic, and I'm glad it's being done.
I'm going to jump in on that topic and use the criteria that you just set up, Terry. On one level, there are incredible tools for introspection. And then, of course, because they are so dependent on your mindset, on your physical setting, on the people you are with, whether it's a guide or a group of friends, intention, that they're tools to explore
Yes.
consciousness. And
Yes.
so they in and of themselves do not have content, but they're like, I think it was Stan Groff who said, it's like a telescope or a microscope for the mind, for consciousness. So to me, the aspect I heard you define, Terry, as soul and having a practice involved, to me, this is also, at least with psychedelics, especially now,
Sure.
is once you have this if you have a transcendent experience, what do you do with it? Because you come back and you're walking around in a world which seems to be populated by people who are very connected and attached to their physical being, to a certain way of looking at the world where maybe they don't feel that they matter. And I just wanted to jump back when we were talking earlier, and I heard, I think it was Terry said something about, or maybe Polly, about not being burned at the stake anymore. Well, now for many people, the equivalent is just being canceled. And there are words that I'm not allowed to say anymore because I'm told that I'm causing microaggressions. I can't say it without laughing. I'm sorry.
Maybe this day will be over sometime.
Well,
My
I hope so. But yeah, I guess I feel like I'm old-fashioned in thinking that I have the right to use words and to think without somebody telling me whether it's people I associate with or the government, what words are acceptable. I mean, there's
or not acceptable to the people you don't associate with.
right. And this goes to partly one of the joyous things or joyful things I've taken away from my work with Polly is being able to really be present and tolerate people who have very different views, very, very different views. And it helps me to hear their view without judgment. So, the idea I hear you saying, Terry, like of service, there's also ecstatic experience. And so, in one sense, I guess my interpretation of where psychedelics fit is I see them as keys to opening up and unraveling consciousness. I mean, I said this to Gould Dolan. You can keep looking in the brain and in these neural pathways. In a way, it may be the equivalent of taking apart a radio or a television and trying to find the set and the people or the broadcaster, right? The radio or the television can receive these signals, but the signal isn't coming from the device. And I know it's a crude analogy.
Well, it's a good analogy.
Thank you. I mean,
And,
consciousness we may find that consciousness is everywhere, and it's not necessarily only restricted to human nervous systems, but all nervous systems that have any awareness to any extent that are sentient are part of a web that contributes to what we all see. It's funny in quantum physics right now, they just read about an experiment with anesthesia and microtubules at the quantum level. And they found that if you give mice, trying to think of what it was, it slowed down or blocked the microtubules, that anesthesia did not have its effect of dimming consciousness. So we're getting experimentally very, very close to this notion. There's this, maybe certain people will say that, it's our awareness of the observer that, quote, what is the term about collapses the wave function to make reality happen. And now there's a very, very strong debate on the frontiers that the wave function never collapses. It seems to be this is the way things are, and that our individual perceptions cannot be separated from what arises. There's no separation. That's all, or much of that may be our subjective impression. And so to me, like the tool of psychedelics expands my awareness beyond what the everyday person accepts as reality. And again, the key challenge for me is, how do I integrate it? How do I live this? How do I walk it in my life? You have this, you can have this glorious expanded awareness of pure joy or ecstasy, of oneness that expands, like I think in Judaism, the prayer, the Shema, ends with the word, Adonai Echad, God is one. It's only in the last decade maybe that I've really spent time contemplating. I mean, repeating that prayer, I guess it never really touched my heart in the way it has more recently, about the acknowledgement, which, Terry, there's this kernel at the center of each, the perennial philosophy, the perennial wisdom, that there's human beings have experienced this kernel of truth, and each nervous system has its unique subjective interpretation and an experience of it, and depending where and when you're born, it also tends to form and shape that. But there's this underlying thread of continuity, which I didn't know if you were going to go back to this notion, Terry, that, even before we were handing this down through language, there was the oral tradition, there was the lived wisdom, there was the shaman, who, in one sense, Polly, like the shaman was a little psychotic, and yet they were the healer. So there wasn't this separation of, they may have kept to themselves, but they performed an important function in the group. And obviously, since this was an oral tradition, we've lost that wisdom. But I believe this is what's contained in the perennial wisdom, is after generations and generations of these oral histories, then it becomes structured, taught. There's a hierarchy. And then, of course, it degenerates over time with any message. Whenever you play telephone, you get around the room, and what you started with is not what you ended with.
Right. So now that you've made that cogent personal observation about where psychedelics fit in your life, there are these other elements too you might consider, as in the unified path.
Well, I think that the issue about the unified path, to me, it's a little like a prism, that it is unified, but it breaks out into these elements that may or may not, for some, at some particular moment, be focused upon. I agree very much. The body, the mind, the heart, and the soul. I do think that distinction between heart and soul is something that we don't need to get into, but I think, well, I think it's important in some way to have some conversation about it eventually, but that all of these have unified moments also, like maybe
Yes,
in some,
but Polly, it isn't simply a matter of understanding the perspective. The perspective calls us to be active
right.
in all of those areas.
Right, right. But then, there may be some unified activities that do unify all of them. And I think that in some, as we've been talking here, I've thought of a number of experiences of my own. But then when Mike was speaking, I was thinking of Howard Nemeroff again, the poet from Washington University, spent most of his life there, who wrote Blue Swallows, When the Mind's Eye Lit the Sun. But he also wrote a poem, it's very short and I can't remember it, on the origins of language. And the poem ends up with this line: "We sat down and talked about it." And so, it's really us talking about this now. Again, humans, this is something that many poets eventually kind of come around to, but Mary Oliver said, our job here as humans is to stand back and say, well, why does that happen? Like, that job is not being done by the dog or by the rock or by the squirrel. They're not asking questions. But the way that we use language and the way we interact with each other pulls out this awareness of our awareness, and then can turn it into, 4 registers or 4 components or 4 aspects, because we sit down and talk about it. And yeah, then we may find out that that's all there is to our awareness, is what we sit down and talk about, that we don't have, that's our function here. Our function, if you follow some traditional paths, our function is to help God become more aware, that God was functioning without a lot of particular awareness. And now we're in the process, all of us, in talking about all of this, of making particularities, more in our awareness. I do think we have these different registers, the body, the mind, the heart, and the soul. Some of us are better at some of us better at others. I guess my own personal concern, I think that awakening is very, very important, but I also think that worship is very, very important. And I wouldn't necessarily call it worship. I would call it devotion typically, but it's a way of lowering the self, lowering the ego,
Yes.
lowering the sort of I need it to be this way. I prefer it. I need the kale right now. That's really, to me, the most difficult human problem, and the one that is hardest to shake, perhaps, among privileged people in this period of time, when people don't grow up, going to church or synagogue or temple or whatever. They grow up, figuring out how they're going to be, I don't know, somebody, Zuckerberg or somebody else, in Silicon Valley making a lot of money. It's kind of what has replaced the idea, or at least until very recently, perhaps that's changed also, but the idea of succeeding in life, or finding the right way. I'm so glad that you've introduced this aspect. I didn't know whether it would be called heart or soul in your system, but that aspect of reducing that sense of ego toward,
Oh, yes.
there needs to be more.
Through what you might call worship or devotion and acts of service, which are all essential. They all efface the ego and reduce the sense of the separate I, and they're all necessary.
Yes, absolutely. And so, I mean, if people want to avail themselves of your teachings and also methods, how would they do that?
We have a website, unifiedpath.org, that has some references. We have a introductory little manual, which is, I think, 20 pages long. We will be having various events where we explore ways of examining and practicing these very elements of the path.
So, Terry, in closing our conversation, I would like it if you could let people know about your fairly recent TED Talk. It's just out there for about a year, and what it's about, because it seems to me, acknowledge this God factor, or whatever you want to call that.
Yes, that TED Talk, which I'm pleased to say is remarkably popular. It turned out to be like number 4 for the year. My original title was Patterns That Point to Unity. Ted thought it would be a more marketable title to call it This Mysterious Pattern That Occurs Throughout the Ages and Across Cultures. And I think they were probably right. But it is available. It's on the TED site and on YouTube. We have a number of Unified Path things available on YouTube too. So we're trying to be available to all those for whom it might be of some help.
If you could you tell people, just in our closing, what this pattern, or how you would put this pattern into words, this pattern that you show us in the TED Talk, but how do you put that pattern into words?
How do I put that pattern into words? It appears to be a complicated pattern, but if one can see what underlies those complications, one finds a simpler pattern that has been recognized over time that in fact points to unity. And that's the whole point of its expression as art in the first place.
So finding that simpler pattern that points to unity is, I think, what people seek in awakening. I think that's a good way of saying it.
That's probably a good way to say it.
Yeah. They
That
want
talk
to
is out there. That talk is out there. It's only 6 minutes. Maybe it's might be helpful to some.
I think so. And Terry Moore has lots of presence on the internet, but also has the same name as a celebrity, a movie celebrity, I think, has the name Terry Moore.
And a baseball player and a cartoonist. So
oh my gosh, okay. So this is the Terry Moore of the Unified Path and Radius Foundation and the Center for Real Dialogue. So
yes, indeed.
so it's been great talking with you, Terry. Thank you so
I would
much.
be happy to hear from anybody with any kinds of questions at any time. Thank you, Polly. And thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Terry. It's been a pleasure. Really nice. Enjoyed this episode of Waking Up Is Not Enough, Flourishing in the Human Space? Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you never miss an episode of insightful discussions and explorations into the human psyche.